with our news in New York City. Here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul. Alex, Lisa, there's late word President Joe Biden's son will likely not testify in his gun case. Hunter Biden's lawyers discussed it over the weekend on whether he would take the stand. He is charged with 3 felonies stemming from the October 2018 purchase of a gun. Prosecutors say he lied on the mandatory gun purchase form by saying he was not illegally using or addicted to drugs. After a crushing defeat in the European Parliament election, French President Emmanuel Macron has called for a snap legislative election to try to persuade voters that his right-wing opposition party would be a dangerous choice. Bloomberg's Irv Chapman reports from Washington.
The centrist leaders who guided the Western Alliance share in that necessity, Terry Haynes, founder of Pangea Group, said in a Bloomberg interview.
They've just come off a D-Day celebration to show a united front, particularly Ukraine. They're going to have to do more than that. They're going to have to actually explain yet again what's at stake, why it's at stake, why they're the better alternative. And that's not just Biden, that's the European leaders.
Haynes said many of the leaders have been complacent as far-right parties gain support in their countries. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
Former President Donald Trump is expected to have his probation interview today following his criminal conviction on falsifying business records. Finally, Caitlin Clark snubbed. The WNBA rookie will not join Team USA for the Olympic Games in Paris. The Indiana Fever guard did not make the roster despite having set several NCAA records her senior year as an Iowa Hawkeye. Clark says it's the most competitive team in the world.
Honestly, no disappointment. I think it just gives you something to work for. That's a dream. Hopefully one day I can be there, and I think it's just a little more motivation.
Clark says she hopes to take part in the next Summer Olympics in Los Angeles in 2028. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. We've got red and green on the screen, but little movement in stocks as the focus shifts to inflation data and a Federal Reserve meeting on interest rates on Wednesday. Policymakers forecast to keep borrowing costs at a two-decade high. RBC said there's a risk of an 8% slump in the S&P 500 if the Fed fails to cut those rates this year. So we have the NASDAQ little changed, up about 2 points at 17,136. The Dow down 0.1% or 55 points at 38,743. And the S&P 500, that's little change, down 4 points at 5,342. The two-year yield, 4.87%. That's down 1 basis point. The yield on the 10-year, 4.46%, and that's up 2 basis points. European elections now having an impact on the euro, which is now down about 0.5% at 107.43 against the dollar. The dollar actually edging higher. And commodities, we'll check in there. Spot gold, we have higher at 2,306 an ounce. We have Brent crude at $80 a barrel. WTI crude at $76 a barrel. Some news about WeWork. Their former New York headquarters, well, it's been taken over by its co-working rival Industrious. They signed a 10-year agreement to manage that 240,000 square foot of space, office space over in Midtown. And since we're talking about workspace, well, if you haven't received that promotion at work, you're not alone. 1.3% of 68 million white-collar professionals in America, they were promoted that first quarter. It's the lowest proportion of data going back 5 years. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
It's just because Paul and I are at the top already.
There you
There's
go.
nowhere for us to go. Like, Paul already anchors 5 hours of radio. Like,
Sure.
What's a promotion? Like
Yes.
12
Get you to
hours?
6.
Like, you know what?
Exactly.
You don't leave that chair all day because you're that awesome. All right, Lisa, thanks a lot. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio, where we cover all the news in business and finance through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies in 130 industries worldwide. We also like to tap our guys over at Bloomberg Economics, amazing men and women who do the economic side of the entire world. David Powell is senior Euro area economist for Bloomberg Economics, and he joins us now. David, BTP Bund spread, right? You have the France versus German 10-year spread, 55 basis points. We haven't seen that all year. You have a huge, huge sell-off in the bond market in some of the main countries, even in Italy and Spain and in Portugal. Equities are getting hit. What do you make of what unfolded over the last 24 hours in France and the European Parliament?
Well, the far-right parties of Europe had very large gains in the European elections. These are the elections for the European Parliament, and that wasn't so much of a surprise in itself, because polls were showing that was likely to happen. But the big surprise is what's happened in France, is the reaction of the French President Emmanuel Macron to the outcome, and he announced a snap parliamentary elections. This won't affect his role as president, because that's a separate election. But soon the French will be going to polls to be voting for new members of Parliament, and for our American listeners, that's similar to the members of the House of Representatives. And then the composition of that lower house may change, and in fact, polls suggest it will, more in favor of the party that just won such a large number of seats in the European Parliament.
So, David, in the European Parliament, what were some of the contributing factors to that strong performance by the far right?
Well, discontent with the way things are going. Of course, that's not unique to Europe. In America, a lot of voters have aired concerns about inflation, what that means for their spending power, and that has that's had a similar impact on the electorate in Europe, where people are upset about these high prices, the cost of living crisis, as they refer to it. But in addition to those developments in France, what they've also had recently is a change to the pension system in order to make it more affordable. So they lifted the retirement age, and that was done by the French president, and it was not a popular move, as you can imagine. No one wants to be told that they have to work for longer in order to receive the same benefits, and that has been a source of support for this, for the far right, which came out at the time opposing that. That's done. They've also come out opposing recent changes that are being discussed to the system of unemployment benefits benefits. So there's now a debate about shortening the duration of unemployment benefits that the government is leading.
So what I find interesting, David, is the idea, and the more I read about it, the more it's like Macron's calling the far right bluff. And it's like, all right, you guys want those policies? Let's see how much you want those policies. What is your assessment as to how risky or not that strategy is and the effect it could have on the economy?
Well, some of the things that Macron has pushed through, like raising the retirement age and this debate about shortening the duration of employment benefits, obviously they're not popular, but they're necessary because France has a huge budget deficit. They're under a lot of pressure from the European Commission to reduce the size of it. Their debt is growing increasingly large, and these reforms will reduce the amount that the government is to pay out to pensioners and the unemployed, and they'll also boost the potential size of the economy. So it's kind of a win-win situation from an economic point of view. And even though these aren't popular, Macron is saying these are necessary steps in order to get the public finances in order. And the far right has been opposed to many of these moves, but they haven't proposed other solutions. So I think one of the things Macron's kind of doing here is saying, you know, you like to be opposed to what I'm doing, but you're not putting forth any solutions yourself. And while you're in opposition, I guess that's your job to oppose the government. But let's see if you can put together some policies yourselves that would solve the problems instead of just complaining about what he has proposed as solutions.
David, can you give us a kind of an overview, just maybe how the economies of Europe are behaving, generally speaking? How are they in terms of growth? How are they in terms of inflation these days? What are the trends?
Well, Europe, like the United States, has had a inflation problem over the last couple of years, and in Europe it was made even worse by the extreme rise in commodity prices that resulted after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So they have that inflation issue that's causing a cost of living crisis, and like the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, very drastically raised interest rates. Although, unlike the United States, it had a major impact on the economy. So when we look back to 2023, I think the U.S. economy grew something like 3%, and the euro area economy did not grow at all. So there's been a much weaker economic performance as a result of the monetary tightening that's taken place.
Yes, we got the ECB that did cut rates. We don't know when the next one's going to be. And then we get this violent move in bond yields. And I appreciate, compare the sovereign debt crisis, it's like peanuts. But nonetheless, it's significant. At what point do bond yields affect everything else, start to affect the economy? Like how high, how long do they have to stay for that to that to be implemented into the economy?
Yeah, I mean, higher financing costs for the government will have implications for the budget deficit and implications for lots of other things. They're used as trademark interest rates in the economy in many places. However, as you said, these are small compared to what Europe dealt with in the past in terms of the euro area debt crisis, and there's very unlikely to be any intervention from the ECB or anything like that, only because not only the movement's small, but during a period of high inflation, it's much more difficult for a central bank to intervene and to justify those moves than it is during a period of low inflation, because of course those interventions require just essentially printing money and using that money to buy those bonds. So we have had some movement in financial markets, but nothing that's screaming crisis, nothing that is screaming for the ECB to jump in and calm the situation.
All right, David, thank you so much. We appreciate that. David Powell, he's a senior Euro area economist for Bloomberg Economics, joining us from London, the HQ for Bloomberg at Queen Victoria Street via that Zoom thing. So again, some big moves. As Alex was pointing out earlier, you have the euro off about 0.5%, 1.07 on the euro. You had the CAC fall off pretty substantially as well. The French index there off about 1.8% in terms of the stock market over there on the news of these snap elections.
So my question is then, do we learn anything about how other elections will be treated, like here in the U.S. or not? We know hedging doesn't work with these things, as we learned, say, with Brexit. So it's going to be very interesting to see how long these moves actually last, which might give us some insight into when they have the elections in July, when the UK has their election in July, and when we have our election as well in November. All right, much more coming up. You're listening to Bloomberg Intelligence. This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. AI is set to take center stage at Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference today. Now, many are waiting to see if more details will be revealed about its deal with OpenAI. Bloomberg's Mark Gurman explains how this partnership evolved.
The win for Apple is that they put their own, arrogance aside, understood that this technology is important to consumers, and despite not having it ready, they haven't trashed it. They've gone in the opposite direction and decided we're going to do as much as we can, at least initially.
And we have Apple shares down about 0.7%. And Apple's conference, not the only event in the spotlight this week. On Thursday, the Tesla board, they're going to be taking another vote on whether to give Elon Musk a $56 billion pay package. We have Tesla shares down about 0.7%. And shares of Southwest Airlines, they're higher. They're up about 6%. The Wall Street Journal reporting activist investor Elliott Investment Management taking a nearly $2 billion stake in the carrier. Bloomberg said Phillips. He explains why Southwest has been lagging behind in the industry.
One, because they only fly 737 aircrafts, and with Boeing under pressure, they aren't able to get new planes. I mean, they've slashed their new plane forecast. They've also sort of had to pull out of some airports, which is rolling back on their network expansion, and we've seen them reconsider their open policy of seating.
That open policy of seating. Sources say Elliott, one of Southwest's largest investors. Moderna said its combination flu and COVID shot met the goals of a key late-stage trial. But that news not giving shares much of a boost. Right now, shares are down about 3%. GameStop shares still lower. They're down 2% after taking a hit Friday following news that it plans to sell new shares. And shares of chipmaker Advanced Micro Devices, they're down too after Morgan Stanley downgrades the company. That is your company news at this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
We are happy Monday. What day is it? It is Monday, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I thought it was Wednesday. That does not bode well for me. Happy Monday. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney and Lisa Mateo. It just bodes well for my week. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We cover all the top news in business and economics through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies in 130 industries worldwide. And we also get you world and national news. And for that, we go to Michael Barr. Who knows? It's not Wednesday. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex. Paul, Lisa. There's late word Hunter Biden's defense team rested their case in his gun trial. His lawyers debated over the weekend whether Biden will take the stand in his own defense in Delaware's federal court. He did not. President Joe Biden's son is charged with 3 felonies stemming from an October 2018 purchase of a gun. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in the Middle East as the latest ceasefire proposal between Hamas and Israel hangs in the balance. As he was leaving Egypt, Blinken indicated the latest plan still faces significant hurdles, but he insists the Israelis are on board. The secretary is pressing leaders in the region to push Hamas into accepting the deal.
The best way, the most effective way to get everyone home, including the American hostages, is through this proposal, is through the ceasefire deal that's on the table right now.
This comes as Israel faces criticism for the high civilian death toll in the latest raid to rescue 4 Israeli hostages being held by Hamas. Former President Donald Trump meets today with probation officers who will recommend his sentence in the New York business records case. Bloomberg's Laura Davison has more from Washington.
This interview will take place virtually. Trump will be in Florida, and the probation officer will be in New York. Or basically, Trump will be asked questions that will then be used as the judge determines his sentence. That sentencing hearing is scheduled for July 11th. That's just a couple days before Trump, is supposed to travel to Milwaukee to accept the Republican nomination on behalf of his party. So it could be a really wild, crazy weeks, depending on what that sentence looks like, whether it's, sentenced to prison or some form of probation.
Bloomberg's Laura Davison. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg hasn't indicated what sentence he'll recommend. The Celtics have a 2-0 lead over the Mavericks in the NBA Finals. Boston beat Dallas 105-98 Sunday. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it. With Bloomberg News Now, I'm Michael Barr. This is Bloomberg, Alex and Paul.
All right, thank you so much, Michael Barr. Here's a great article that's reading high on the terminal. And I want to get your insight on this, Paul, because Lou Wang wrote this great piece about a diversification and how money managers who obeyed the financial industry's old age wisdom to divide investments across markets and geographies are apparently on an epic losing streak versus those who simply bought the S&P and hung out. This I find to be extraordinarily depressing. In one example, one of roughly 370 asset allocation funds tracked by Morningstar, just one has managed to beat the index since 2009.
It's been we all kind of grew up with, I think, with a 60-40 portfolio construction, 60% equities, 40% bonds, kind of a risk-reward kind of scenario there, balance out your portfolio. And even to this day, you know, we have advisors come in here who stress diversification and so on and so forth. But the reality is, for a period of time, and it seems like at least for the last couple, 3 years, it's been those magnificent 7 stocks, those big cap, large cap tech. If you haven't been in those names, you've underperformed. And that's why one of the reasons I think, you know, Dan Ives from Woodbush Securities, he's just been super long and bullish for tech for as long as he's, you know, we can all remember. That's been the call.
Yeah.
That's been the call.
And we can make fun of him for being, oh, you're bullish tech, shocker.
Yeah.
But it's true. And Cambria Funds had some data out on this and said that the streak of underperformance that we're seeing is getting really historic. Diversified portfolios have trailed the U.S. large cap stock index in 13 of the past 15 years. So that's not just AI.
Yeah.
Clearly. But clearly, this AI-fueled equity melt-up situation and then how long this upcycle can be. And even though all of these stocks are kind of off their highs, nonetheless, if this is a cycle that lasts many years and is adopted really quickly, what do you do?
Exactly. So, I mean, a lot of folks say you just got to be long big tech and then, you know, try to trade around the edges there for performance. But again, even with Apple, and Apple's only up 1.5% this year, although it's rallied, you know, pretty aggressively off those lows recently.
All right, well, coming up in the next hour, Ken Fisher, partner at Fisher Brothers, on the state of commercial real estate. He will be in studio. We'll also get your check on Apple before WWDC. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to check in with Jackie Davalos, Bloomberg technology reporter. She's at Apple's worldwide headquarters in Cupertino, California for their developer conference today. We get a preview of what we're going to hear from our good friends at Apple. Alex Harris, Bloomberg short-term interest rate reporter. She joins us on the big take story entitled Talent Exit at Williams New York Fed. Still concerns on its way. Get a sense of what's happening there. Then Ken Fisher, partner at Fisher Brothers, going to talk to us about the state of commercial real estate. Are we at or near the bottom for commercial real estate? We'll check in there. Right now, let's kick everything off this hour like we do with Mr. Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much, Paul Sweeney. Lots going on today. You mentioned WWDC. Apple shares down 0.7%. This Bloomberg Business Flash brought to you by Commonwealth, supporting more than 2,000 independent financial advisors with the solutions they need to grow a thriving business. Commonwealth. Go where you grow. The Dow right now lower by 97 points. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average down by about 0.25%. S&P 500 index down 3 points. Little change there, less than 1/10%. And NASDAQ is up 23, a gain of 1/10%. 10-year 4.45% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.87%. Gold up 0.4%, back above 2,300, 23.02. West Texas Intermediate crude advancing 1.5%, 76.69 for a barrel of WTI. A sell-off in European assets amid heightened political risk is hitting stocks and bonds around the globe. Also, investors are positioning for this week's Fed decision on Tuesday. According to RBC Capital Markets, investors do remain too optimistic about the timing of a Federal Reserve interest rate cut. Lori Calvasina is head of U.S. equity strategy at RBC Capital Markets, and she was the guest this morning on Bloomberg Intelligence.
We think there's some modest downside from here. We do think at this point in time, based on our modeling, this idea of getting 1, maybe 2 cuts, and, you know, kind of inflation coming down to 2.6 on PCE, that seems to be fully reflected in stock prices around 5,300 if you use the consensus earnings numbers.
RBC's Lori Calvasina, and to be sure, the S&P now at 53.44. NVIDIA's 10-for-1 stock split has taken effect, giving investors 9 additional shares for every one that they already own. NVIDIA today up by about 0.9%. Again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed. We have got the Dow, the S&P, they are both lower. NASDAQ up by 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. I learned in the last 10 minutes that it is not Wednesday.
Yes.
So there's that. So happy Wednesday, everybody. So one stock that is getting a lot of love today is Southwest. It's up by about 7%. Elliott is targeting the company in an activist push. The company had a comment, an emailed statement just about 10 minutes ago. They say they're confident in the CEO management's ability and they look forward to better understanding Elliott's views. I'm sure they do. Abigail Doolittle covers markets for us for Bloomberg Television, and she's looking at some of the big movers of the day. So Southwest up big. We'll see, right? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly having its best day since 2022 on this possibility that Elliott can really create value out of the stock. They're saying, they're making a pretty bold prediction, saying that by making various operational and management changes, they think it's a $49 stock. That's greater than 75% upside potential appreciation. The other thing that should be noted, their $1.9 billion stake is really pretty large relative to market cap. Yeah, I mean, they're going to be, they're really, really taking a stake here. When you think back for Southwest 2 years ago, that December with the technical issues, you know, it's interesting that they're targeting this company. It seems as though they can really, I don't want to say turn it around, but maybe take it to
be a catalyst for some change.
Take it to another level. And I haven't flown on Southwest in years. I used to fly on them frequently for business down in Texas. It's basically like a taxi down there, going from city to city. But, you know, based on that experience, there was a fair amount, you know, that could be improved. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do. And I think that they are upgrading their technology. In the first quarter of this year, their maintenance costs, and I don't know if it was the technology, but really rose. That's true for all of the airlines, but really rose for Southwest in particular. Now, Southwest, I mean, you now basically are going to have this battle, for lack of a better way to put it. I mean, you know, Elliott's saying that he wants the CEO gone, some other folks from the C-suite gone, and Southwest is you know, defending their position and defending things as they are. The one question could be for the relative near term, will they be able to form a coalition so that they can work together for the benefit of the company and shareholders?
Yeah, and to the technology, you guys remember it was a couple years ago they had that horrific holiday disruption in 2022 because they didn't have the right technology to be able to reroute crews and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
You're looking at CrowdStrike also. That stock is up by 9%. What's going on here?
Well, we did hear Friday after the close last week that the S&P 500 annual rebalancing, or quarterly rebalancing, excuse me, that CrowdStrike, KKR, and GoDaddy. GoDaddy is kind of interesting, only from the standpoint that I would have thought it was like a penny stock, but it's actually greater than, let's see, $100. It is a $142 stock.
Yeah.
Its market cap is, I guess that's more important than the share size, a $20 billion company. Like that's sort of surprising to me. I actually have a GoDaddy website, and they're great, but that's surprising. That stock's also up 2.2%, and KKR is up, let's see, almost 10% as well. And this is because, of course, index managers, they have to drop the stocks that were dropped and then scoop these ones up before the rebalance on June 24th. So there's this, you know, just this initial sort of tag-along effect.
Aren't there people out there or investors out there that speculate on what's going to be added and taken out of indexes?
Yes, and I think that one of these that I was looking at seemed as though that was the case, and it was CrowdStrike, but a little while ago, because now it's at session highs, but it had been, you know, it was up on Friday, and it had a really good day last week, although I'm going to look really quickly to see whether or not that's earnings. But yes, they are absolutely doing that. How you do that was earnings last week when it had the 12% pop. You know, how you do that kind of speculation, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, this is,
I'm sure there are qualifications. Like there's
in terms of the market
KKR
cap
seems like almost a no-brainer. It's $95 billion market cap. It's KKR. You know, it seems like that would be a no-brainer. All right, Abigail, thank you so much for that. We really appreciate it. Abigail Doolittle, she covers all the markets for Bloomberg Television Radio like no one else. We appreciate getting a few minutes of her time. One of the big stories of the day is happening out in Cupertino, California. Our good friends at Apple, they have their developers conference there. That's when a bunch of those geeks get together and they talk about applications they can do on the Apple platform, and a lot of smart people in the room. And it's widely anticipated this year because a lot of folks want to get a sense of where Apple is in terms of rolling out an AI strategy. Jackie Davalos is there, Bloomberg technology reporter. Jackie, what's the anticipation level there out in Cupertino today for Apple?
The energy is really high and people are starting to trickle in. Remember, the major keynote address delivered by Tim Cook will start at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. your time, so just under 2 hours. This is where he's going to lay out the artificial intelligence vision. We have a little bit of a preview thanks to Mark Gurman's reporting, and a major part of that will be Apple Intelligence. This is the new software upgrade that will be applied to the iPhone, iPad, the Macs that will have a lot of these AI features. Some of those, which we can look forward to, include summarization of your text messages, web articles, but also some custom emojis, adding some fun features in there, an upgrade to its mail system. But the one that I'm looking forward to the most is just exactly what's going to happen to Siri. Will this new partnership with OpenAI, which will be part of that keynote address, really revamp its AI assistant? Because as you mentioned earlier, Matt, it's kind of been somewhat of a disappointment in recent years, especially when you think about the biggest AI push over the last year.
What about security issues and things along those lines? Because basically they're using cloud for AI, which is something that they don't like doing. They don't like using cloud. What are we going to hear around that?
It's going to be a major focus. That's the one area where Apple has always placed a major emphasis on: privacy, protecting customer data. When you think about generative artificial intelligence, it feeds off of user data in a way that has gotten Google and perhaps even OpenAI in trouble, especially when you think about the amount of data that is required to power these large language models. Apple is going to be clear just exactly how it tends to walk that fine line. But then, of course, you mentioned cloud. You know, this is a major area of monetization for them as well. We have cloud storage, and it depends on people kind of clicking that pricey storage option to keep that money coming in. It also monetizes using apps via the App Store. Exactly how this is going to take shape in this new era of AI is still a little yet to be seen, but we'll get some detail on that today as well.
All right, Jackie, thank you so much for joining us. Jackie Davalos, tech reporter, Bloomberg News. She is live at Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference in Cupertino, California. Big day for Apple and tech and AI and all that good stuff. Well, you know we love these big take stories here at Bloomberg News. That's where our reporters at Bloomberg News, they do some really awesome deep dives and on some really interesting stories. Today is no different. How about this one? Talent exit at Williams New York Fed stokes concern on its sway. Alex Harris joins us, Bloomberg short-term interest rate reporter here. So, Alex, thanks so much for joining us here in our studio. The New York Federal Reserve Bank, that's a big one. And so what's happening with our friends at the New York Fed? Because we need to pay attention to this.
Yeah, so what's kind of happened over the last couple of years is you've seen an exodus of basically senior management. These are people who have been with the bank for decades, just deciding to exit, either that they retire or that they, find another opportunity on Wall Street, or just really, but what's ultimately driving it is the environment is just not, they have found just not conducive, either that, there's been changes in the bank under the leadership of John Williams that they have found doesn't necessarily work for them anymore, and as a result they're leaving. And what people are worried about is the so-called brain drain. It leaves a vacuum of people who are experienced at fighting crises, because remember, a lot of these people have been there. They were there for the financial crisis. They were there for the repo market blow up. They were there in 2020. Like, they have crisis fighting experience, and so you're leaving a lot of that knowledge is leaving the bank. But then also just their ability and the question of are they ready for whatever's next? And that's what people are really concerned, is they're feeling like something is severely lacking under the leadership of John Williams.
First of all, I love that you wrote this because Alex is usually the person that has those really nerdy repo market articles where you're like, I know this is important. I know I'm going to read it 3 times, and I'm still going to understand 20% of it, and I have to email Alex Harris. So thank you for writing an article that I understood right off the bat. What did they do about that then? I mean, is it as easy as like, hey, we're going to offer more work from home? Is it not that at all? Is it something very different?
I think it's very different. I think really what people are going to have to start looking at is taking a really serious look at the role of the New York Fed. You know, for some people, they've said, look, Lori Logan got elevated out of the New York Fed to running the Dallas Fed, and she's taken a lot of that staff with her. She has this experience on the balance sheet. People really trust her. So now people are wondering, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be New York that carries out, you know, the implementation of the Fed's policies when it comes to their balance sheet. Like, this could shift to Dallas. So people are starting to ask that question or pose that question. At the same time, though, you know, people are pushing back and saying, no, this has to be in New York. We need to fix what is happening in New York. We need to retain talent in New York because the banks are here. And if something happens with the banking system, it's much easier to call everyone down to Liberty Street and say, hey, get in here. We got to figure this out, than trying to cull people all the way down to Dallas and say, hey, we got to figure this out.
So historically, the New York Fed has been the branch that manages the Treasury's balance sheet, correct? Buying and selling bonds?
Well, the Fed's balance sheet. So their holdings are Treasuries and MBS and such.
So it's been done, and again, they have traders there and stuff that do this. I mean, this is where it happens in New York.
Well, and you have other, like Chicago still has, you know, market analysis people. Like, they still have all these things coming out of the other banks, but it is primarily a function of the New York Fed. They're tasked with managing their Fed's portfolio. Roberto Perli is the SOMA manager, so he manages the Fed securities portfolio. You know, so these things, and so the New York Fed really post-financial crisis has just taken on such a larger role. They've essentially become like a giant broker-dealer, just given the size and the sheer size of their balance sheet. And that's, you know, someone like Christopher Whalen is making the argument that you don't need an academic. You don't need an academic running the New York Fed. You need someone who's comfortable with operations, with the nuts and bolts, and can kind of see it from a more markets-oriented perspective than an academic one.
So how do they pitch that? Because who's going to give up a job at Goldman that pays a nice chunk of change? Actually, I have no idea how much the New York Fed does, but I have to assume it's less. So how do they do it?
It's like, I think, when I last look at the annual report from 2023, I think it's like a little over $500,000 that the president of the New York Fed makes. But I mean, look, Beth Hammack, who ran the Goldman Sachs funding arm, she's elevated. She's taking the role as the Cleveland Fed president. You know, Lori Logan could always, you know, people are speculating that she could come back to New York and run it. You know, these are the kinds of people I think that they envision when they're thinking about the role and who could, you know, possibly, you know, helm the New York Fed after John Williams, you know, decides to retire or step down.
Do we have a problem with John Williams? Is that are people placing the blame on these departures on John Williams and his style, or?
You know what? I think it's a bit of both. I think, you know, again, you know, when we spoke to people, the message was always, he is a brilliant macroeconomist, but just ill-suited for the role. I also think culturally, the other sense I got from people is that, you know, culturally, it's very different than the San Francisco Fed, which is what he was running for 7 years before he came and took the role in New York. It's just very different. And, you know, sometimes culturally people don't fit, and that's okay. And so that's something to also think about. And so I think it's a bit of both. I think it is somewhat of the culture and just sort of a not meshing. Right. You know, they were just sort of ill-suited for each other.
All right, we'll keep an eye on that. Yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah, Alex Harris, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Alex Harris, she's a short-term interest rate reporter working on the big take story here today. Talent exit at Williams, New York, stokes concern on its sway in the marketplace about the New York Federal Reserve. And you can catch those big take stories, Bloomberg.com/big take, or go on the Bloomberg Terminal NI space big take. Another good one today here.
All right, we're just about, what, 2 hours? A little under 2 hours away from the start of Apple.
Yeah, I think
WWDC. That's going to be pretty exciting. The stock isn't doing that much. I'm also interested in NVIDIA. Just a quick check on here on where NVIDIA is trading. You get that stock split. The stock now is up by 0.8%, but there was some really fun research out from Goldman, also Julian Emanuel over at Evercore ISI, talking about what happens usually in these big tech stock splits. Goldman saying that usually the stock rallies by about 4% in the week after the announcement. After that, we don't really know where the traction goes, but typically with these big companies when they stock split, that's usually how that works out. All right, much more coming up. We're going to talk to Ken Fisher about commercial real estate. Stay tuned for that conversation. Partner over at Fisher Brothers. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks, little changed right now. We got the Fed meeting on Wednesday right now. The S&P unchanged on the day. Yes, up a half a point, 53.47. Dow Industrials down 76, drop there of 0.2%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is up 29, higher by 0.2%. 10-year 4.46% right now, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.87%. Spot gold up 0.5%, $23.05 for an ounce of the precious metal, while West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.8%, $76.92 for a barrel of WTI. In the airline industry, we've got shares of Southwest Airlines taking off. They're up now by about 8.1%. Elliott Investment Management has called for new leadership at Southwest and an overhaul of its business strategy after revealing a $1.9 billion stake in the carrier. Again, Southwest shares up by 8.1%. Recapping, mixed Monday, back to work Monday with the S&P little changed, up 1 point right now. Dow Industrials down 0.2%. NASDAQ up 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pelleton, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in Midtown Manhattan, what I'm going to call an A-plus building. We're also streaming live on YouTube as well, so you can head over to YouTube and search Bloomberg Podcast. Talking about real estate on the commercial side, it is a hot topic for a lot of folks, particularly those in larger markets where you're really trying to figure out how this commercial real estate, particularly the office real estate market, is going to shake out here and what the impacts it'll have across the economy. We have an expert with us today. Ken Fisher joins us. He's a partner at Fisher Brothers. Joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Ken, thanks so much for joining us here. Let's just start right here in New York City. Office real estate, what's your view?
Well, we're looking at a bifurcated market. There's the Class A trophy market, and there's just about everything else.
Okay.
What we've seen in our portfolio is a lot of activity. Tours are still fairly robust, and we've made some very, very big deals, some of the biggest deals in the country over the last year and a half.
Yeah, let's get to some of that. Just to give perspective to the listeners, Fisher Brothers has a core commercial portfolio in New York City, right? That includes 1345 Avenue of the Americas, 299 Park Avenue, and Park Avenue Plaza. Like, these are like big, huge centers that are really iconic in the financial industry. Talk to us about the kind of leases that you were signing, say, last year, and what kind of leases are you signing this year?
Well, that's been fairly consistent. The rents themselves have been fairly stagnant. They haven't moved much.
Okay.
What has moved is the net effective rents. The rents after you factor in tenant improvement allowances and brokerage commissions and free rent. That number has gotten hit substantially. The amount of landlord work has also increased. So as part of making the deal, there's tenant improvement allowance. There's also the work that the landlord has to do in terms of capital expenditures to make the buildings leasable.
So take, for example, at 1345 Avenue of the Americas, which those of us who have been here for more than 15 minutes call 6th Avenue, Paul Weiss, big New York City law firm, just took, I guess, a 15-year, 143,000 square foot lease. So is that new space? Or are they just kind of repositioning space? And what did you have to do? Did you have to put in pool tables and ping pong tables and all that kind of silliness?
I wish it was that simple, Paul. First, it was 765,000 square feet. We had a 1 million square foot vacancy facing us in 2025 with Alliance Bernstein moving out to Nashville.
Oh, that's right.
And so, before the pandemic, we actually looked inside the portfolio because we knew that we were competing now not only with our comp set, but also with new construction. We had seen millions and millions of square feet of new construction that we hadn't seen since the 60s.
Oh, wow.
And so we knew we had to invest and reposition the portfolio. And so we did so, and then, of course, the pandemic hit. And so in the middle of repositioning these assets with massive amenities like we see here in this building, we also had to modify our stance and start COVID-proofing the buildings. So we did HVAC work, a touchless experience, Bluetooth technology, all of that stuff that we hear about, we incorporated into our portfolio. And the result was, while again, we said that rents were fairly stable, it was the amount of work that it took to get Paul Weiss in.
Yep.
So it was not just what we saw in the deal itself, but what we had to do to reposition the building to get Paul Weiss to look at it.
So was that a healthy commercial real estate market? Is that an investment cycle? Like, how would you then describe it?
Well, again, we're looking at a bifurcated market. So, we're competing with other Class A assets. And so we, long before the pandemic hit, we just knew what we were going to have to do. There was a stat that came out years ago that almost 60% of the market was over 60 years or older. And so we fell into that concept. We fell into that grouping. And so it became very, very important for us to reinvest in the portfolio. And I think you'll see that those who have reinvested and spent the capital expenditures necessary to reposition their buildings have had some activity, and those who haven't have not.
One of my first Wall Street interviews was in Park Avenue Plaza, the old First Boston Corporation, back in the day, and I was like, "Oh, this is a real office."
This is a real place. Yes.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does for many reasons. What percentage of New York City is A type of quality?
Gee, that's a tough statistic.
I mean, it's a 10, 20%. I mean, it's not 50%.
No, it's not 50%.
So it's less than that. So I'm just getting to the question. Bloomberg News, I referenced this article many times. A year and a half ago, 2 years ago, Bloomberg News wrote a story about 3rd Avenue, Times Square, to right where we are at Bloomberg's headquarters here at 58th Street. What do you do with that inventory? Because that's not A inventory for the most part.
No, it's not. If you look at the submarkets, you can kind of look at it from that perspective. Park Avenue, 6th Avenue, these are the hot markets. These are the hot places that a lot of deals are going because of the flight to quality that exists when market conditions take a little bit of a slump. What we've seen is we have a building at 605 3rd Avenue which straddles 2 submarkets. And so, look, it puts everything on the table. We've even examined the possibility of conversion to residential, which, again, takes a lot of resources to do. So that's something that we've discussed. I don't think it's going to be relevant to 605, but again, it's looking at the market in the form of submarkets and what is happening, and you can see the data, where most of these deals are happening are along those markets.
Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Well, but I guess my question is, just pick a building out of thin air on 3rd Avenue, the Lipstick Building, because maybe some people who are out of town can think about that building. That's what we're talking about. If that were to trade hands today, 50% discount from pre-pandemic?
Just about, I would say.
Wow.
Pretty close.
That is amazing. That's, to me, we haven't seen that market clear, have we?
No,
But does it have to?
It has
I mean,
to.
is someone going to sell the building tomorrow?
The loans are coming up to be refinanced, and they have to do with a higher interest rate environment. So a lot of hands are going to be forced in the next couple of years, don't you think?
I think you're more likely to see in a lot of cases, workouts where there'll be more equity required, to be invested back in. There'll be stricter covenants, more leasing reserves and reserves in general. I think you'll see that rather than the keys being handed back. And if it's a B or a C market, you might see residential conversions be discussed. I think, it's going to depend, in relation to that, it's going to depend a lot on when the loan matures as it relates to lease expirations.
Yep.
In terms of your reinvestment, the equity you have to put in, are you done in that cycle, or are you still putting in a bunch of cash to update all your stuff?
No, we have repositioned our portfolio. And I can still eat, so that's good.
He laughs at himself when he talks about it.
We have made a substantial reinvestment, and the results are that we have leased.
But that cycle's done for you.
For us, yes.
Yes. Okay. Do you feel like others are they also starting to do it now, or do you feel like for everyone that cycle is done?
No, I think it depends again on the asset and the submarket. You got to be very careful about the amount of money. You have to do it surgically. You can't invest the same amount of money that you would put into 1345, say at 605, as an example. So I think there'll be some buildings yet to be repositioned, and there'll be some buildings that have gone through the cycle.
Would you, I don't know if you have a speculative part of your company that says, I'm going to go bid 30 cents on the dollar for this building on 3rd Avenue, because I think at that valuation, even if I have to put money into that building, I can make a good return. Are you guys thinking about that, or are you just kind of focusing on your core portfolio?
No, I think we have enough to focus on right now. We've actually developed over the last couple of years about 1,200 multifamily, with 300 yet to come down in Wynwood, Miami. We're developing that right now. I think as far as we are concerned. We also have a major immersive retail experiential development in Las Vegas. That's plenty for us right now.
Okay. Ken Fisher, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Ken Fisher, he's a partner at Fisher Brothers. For those of you who don't know it, I mean, particularly in what I've learned about commercial real estate, it is oftentimes a family business, and there's a handful of New York real estate families, including the Fishers, but you think about the Dursts and the Tishmans and the Rudins and all that, and the Fishers are right there, and it's kind of a family business for a lot of these companies with substantial Wall Street support, of course, in terms of financing, but you go around New York City and other major markets and you see the same names time and time again in terms of it.
We're all in our fourth generation now.
Yeah, fourth generation.
So,
just
pretty
it's
impressive.
A family business. Great stuff. Ken Fisher, thank you very much. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul. Alex, Charlie. Hunter Biden's lawyers have rested their case in the federal gun trial of the president's son in Delaware without putting him on the stand. According to the New York Times, President Biden's son was angered by the government's tough cross-examination of his daughter, Naomi Biden-Neal, on Friday. He told his defense lawyers he would consider testifying, but after a weekend of consultations, Hunter Biden and his lead lawyer, Abby Lowell, decided against that. After a crushing defeat in the European Parliament elections, French President Emmanuel Macron is plunging his country into new political uncertainty. He's called a snap legislative election that pits him once again against his perennial far-right rival, Marine Le Pen. She spoke through an interpreter.
By giving more than 32% to the National Rally, the French have just given us the highest score. All parties combined in 40 years. It's a real emotion to see this beautiful popular force rising up throughout the country.
The election in France will take place beginning June 30th. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East discussing ongoing negotiations and a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. Before leaving Egypt, Blinken told reporters on the tarmac, while he doesn't know if Hamas will accept the current proposal, he says Egyptian counterparts have been in touch with Hamas.
Ultimately, I can't put myself, none of us can put ourselves in the minds of Hamas or its leaders, so we don't know what the answer will be.
The State Department calls it an opportunity to urge Hamas to accept the proposal. Climate activists were arrested outside Citigroup's headquarters in downtown Manhattan this morning after they gathered to block bank employees from entering the building. More than 20 protesters have been arrested. Protesters are demanding the bank stop financing fossil fuels. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with a developing story headline right off the Bloomberg Professional Service. Edgar Bronfman eyeing a $2 to $2.5 billion bid for National Amusements. This, according to the Wall Street Journal. Bain Capital is backing Bronfman in that possible bid, again, according to the Wall Street Journal. Stocks right now are trading mixed. We do have the S&P higher, little changed, up 0.1% right now. The S&P up 5. Dow Industrials down 45, drop there of 0.1%, while NASDAQ is up 51, a gain of 0.3%. Russell 2000 in the red, down 0.1%, 10-year at 4.46%, the 2-year 4.87%. Gold up 0.5%, 23.06 right now for an ounce of gold, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.3%, 77.27 for a barrel of WTI. Wall Street, meanwhile, looking ahead to the CPI report on Wednesday and the Fed decision at 2 o'clock Wall Street time. Caterina Simonetti is Senior Portfolio Manager at Morgan Stanley.
So it will be perfectly natural if Fed would want to postpone the decision of the rate cuts that market put so much emphasis on towards later in the year. So quite frankly, we're not expecting big surprises either from the Fed decision or from the CPI data. We think that they are going to remain on hold and, see what happens. And they would probably like to see more data.
Caterina Simonetti of Morgan Stanley. This could be a monumental day for Apple. Shares lower right now, down 0.7%. The Developers Conference will be kicking off shortly, and that conference will show whether the iPhone maker can become a major player in the growing field of artificial intelligence. Right now, ahead of the start, we do have Apple shares down 0.7%. Stay with Bloomberg for updates throughout the day. Again, recapping here, S&P up 5 right now, 53.52, a gain of 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business and economics and finance through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries around the world. And every week at this time, we also tap our colleagues over Bloomberg NEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They do great research that covers commodities, power, transport, industry, buildings, ags, and cutting technologies, and basically anything that you need to know about sustainability as we move towards net zero at some point in the future. 10, 20, 30 years, I don't know, something along those lines. Joining us now is Sung Choi, metals and mining analyst at Bloomberg NEF, and he joins us now in the Interactive Broker Studio. There was an amazing piece that you guys did that talked about how much metals an energy transition is going to mean. If we get to net zero power by 2050, we're going to need to buy, and by we, I mean the world, will need about $10 trillion worth of metals to get there. What is my question? What metals? How do we get it? Is that enough? That's an enormous amount.
Yes. So as we progress through the technologies where we shift from fossil fuel to clean energy, and with the innovation in technologies, especially in the transportation sector and data sector as well, and power grids, more metals will be needed. In order to get the electrons flow, you need metals. That's pretty obvious, right? Now, the particular categories of metals that are of interest lately is lithium and copper. Those two metals are very interesting at this moment.
Where do we get these metals, and is that a concern where we do get them?
Yes, that is a concern. So for me, demand is of a concern, but it isn't too much of a concern. Supply is more of the concern. The reason for that is, the reason that I say that is because many of the places that have this particular resource, such as copper and lithium, are in areas where it has very sensitive political and social landscape. And in order to get those supply out of the ground, right, miners have to navigate through those complicated situations, right? For example, just starting this year or end of last year, many people forecast that the copper will be in surplus for 2024.
Will be a surplus?
Yeah, it will be a slight surplus for 2024. That was the expectation.
Okay.
But then at the start of this year, right, in Panama, Cobre Panama, was shut down for many reasons, right? As a result of that, we're experiencing this run up in copper prices, because there's a dislocation between copper mine supply and the smelter capacity.
So here is where I think raises the problem, because you're looking at a structural shift among metals that are cyclical. So that's one area where we were surprised to the upside, and now we're going to see a deficit. But then I look at lithium, and we knew the EV revolution and the batteries, we were going to need lithium. So all of a sudden, the lithium guys, and a lot of them are in South America, went gangbusters. They're like, we need all this lithium. It's going to be awesome. The demand's going to be there. And then the prices crashed. And then they had to shut down some of their operations because it wasn't economic anymore. We do need the lithium, but we didn't need it that day.
Yeah.
How do we manage that?
So, with everything, timing is everything, but it's really impossible to predict any type of timing with any type of investments, right? So copper is in its moment right now. For lithium, that was 2 years ago, right? All this hype around electric vehicles, use of lithium, difficulties in getting lithium. So all the investment poured into lithium space, and as a result of that, there is an oversupply issue with lithium, right? But despite the oversupply issue, the lithium industry is really at the cusp of a paradigm shift in technology innovation, right? There's this thing called direct lithium extraction technology, where you take the...
Direct lithium extraction?
Yes, direct lithium extraction technology. So there's two routes where you could extract lithium. There's mainly hard rock lithium, where you take the spodumene, you mine it out of rock, and you process it. Other process is brine. You take the brine, and you extract the lithium out of it. But
water, think water, basically.
Yes. Okay. So, but using evaporating method. So you're using sunlight to evaporate the water out of it and extract lithium, and that takes 2 years. Now DLE, or direct lithium extraction process, that's gonna bring that lead time down to 2 weeks instead of 2 years.
Oh.
So main competition versus hard rock, that is, right? Now that's going to be a game changer for the industry, where it's gonna actually lower the cost curve, right? It may lower the cost curve. It's a bit too early to tell right now, but at the cusp of commercialization of this technology, it may lower the cost curve, and it may change the industry forever.
But the idea then is that when they can time the cycles a little better, so they don't have to deal with a 2-year cycle. If they can deal with a couple weeks, they can be more reactive to demand, right? Is that the point behind that?
Right.
Because in essence, though, it's still an issue. And timing is hard, particularly when a project can get held up, etc. You said that copper's having its moment.
Right.
How long do you think that moment lasts for?
I think, so obviously there's going to be volatility. There's going to be ups and downs in the market. But what we project is that one thing very important to note is that in terms of primary copper supply, meaning the copper supply that's out of the mine, that always has been in deficit, around 3 million tons. That shortfall is partially offset by secondary copper supply, meaning recycled coppers, right?
Okay.
Now, what we are projecting, because of difficulty in building new mines and getting the permits necessary for copper mines, that primary copper deficit will increase to 5 million tons by 2027, right? Now, you could ideally say that, you just need recycled copper, right? You just need scrap, right? But not all scrap is created equal, right? There is certain grade of scrap that are needed for smelters in order to produce that refined copper that's necessary for the energy transition, right? And that's not enough too, right? I think, so in a sense, because of the lowering of the copper grades in the mines as well, it's sort of, structural issue that has to be dealt with. We just need more mine and more streamlined process, but
All right.
So longer.
Maybe I'll go into the mining business. You won't let me go down to Texas and start drilling for oil
I'm not letting you
and
do
gas.
that. Yeah, just look through your house, see what you can recycle.
Yeah, exactly. Sung Choi, thank you so much for joining us. Sung Choi is a metals and mining analyst at Bloomberg BNEF. joining us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. And again, the energy transition, there's so many ripples. That simple people like me, I just can't.
But no, but you can even see it in the equity market. Like HVAC guys and power guys have been sort of blowing up. I mean, they've just been blowing past basic AI plays like NVIDIA over the last few months because of that. Anyway, this is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. The U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to consider killing a multi-billion-dollar shareholder lawsuit that accuses Meta Platforms of misleading investors about the data harvesting scandal involving the political consulting firm Cambridge Analytica. The justices say they will decide whether a federal appeals court was wrong to let the lawsuit go forward based on allegations that the company, then known as Facebook, inflated share prices by inadequately disclosing the risk that its user data would be misused. Meta Platform shares today, they are trading higher now by 1.7%. In Cupertino, Apple's developers will be showing whether the iPhone maker can become a major player in the growing field of artificial intelligence, marking a critical moment for a company that's forced to adapt to a new era. Bloomberg's Dana Woolman spoke this morning with our Jonathan Farrow about what to expect out of Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference.
So Apple, belatedly, many would argue, is going to be working artificial intelligence into just about every aspect of the user experience. That includes summarizing notifications, web pages, emails, enhanced photo editing features, and as you say, AI emoji, where if you're typing and maybe there isn't already an emoji that fits what you're describing, it'll make it up on the fly. At least that's what we've reported. And you can see I'm a little giddy. That sounds especially cool to me.
Bloomberg's Dana Woolman. Apple shares right now down by 0.8%. Tesla is urging a Delaware judge to reject an unusual proposal by lawyers who defeated Elon Musk's $56 billion compensation package and now want their legal fees paid with about $5.6 billion of stock in the electric car maker. And those are our top company stories.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Monday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele, alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news and analysis from our great Bloomberg Intelligence staff. They cover 2,000 companies in 130 industries worldwide. We also keep you up to date on world and national news, and for that, we go to Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex. Paul, Charlie, Hunter Biden's defense team rested their case today without testimony in his federal firearm trial. The decision to rest caps a week of dramatic and often personal testimony in which family members and former lovers of President Joe Biden's son testified about his addiction to crack cocaine from 2015 to 2019. The prosecution and defense will give closing arguments after a lunch break. The jury will have to determine whether he's guilty of illegally buying and possessing a gun in mid-October of 2018 after he checked no to a question on a form about whether he was an active unlawful user of any controlled substance. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East pushing a U.S. ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. Before leaving Egypt, Blinken on the tarmac with reporters discussed his agenda for the week.
I can't go into the details of our conversations today except to say that our Egyptian counterparts were in communication with Hamas as recently as a few hours ago.
It comes after Israel's successful mission to rescue 4 Israeli hostages held in Hamas captivity for 9 months. However, scores of civilians were killed in the mission. The European Union is licking their wounds after the right made huge gains in parliamentary elections. For the past 2 years, senior leaders have been noting how unified Europe is. This vote shows it is not. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
We may differ on individual points, but we all have an interest in stability, and we all want a strong and effective Europe.
The right could now become a major player in policies ranging from immigration to security and climate. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron is calling for snap elections. He dissolved the lower house of parliament and called new legislative elections after his party came a distant second to Marine Le Pen's far right in Sunday's European parliamentary vote. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Alex, Charlie.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael Barr. Appreciate that. So this was a crazy thing that happened yesterday. Basically, a section of Wyoming's Teton Pass just collapsed.
Yep.
And this is so important because it links Idaho to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and it's right near Grand Teton National Park. It's closed indefinitely, and you just see, like, over a period of a few days,
Yep.
it just all of a sudden erodes, and then boom, just drops. Like,
Yep.
it's gone.
I saw some amazing videos out there on social media, and it literally just, just disappears and falls down the side of a mountain, and you start to think, how did they build that in the first place?
I was thinking the same thing. Like, how do you repair it?
And how do you repair it? I'm just kind of looking at the side of the mountain, like, how do those engineering people even come up with a design that actually stays, like, you can build a road on the side of a sheer cliff, but I tell you, having lived in California for a long time, they do it there all over the place. And they have mudslides and rock falls on Highway 1 down there around Big Sur. They're dealing with that. So I don't know what they're going to do. So I just bumped into Michael McKee in the hallway, and he said it will not impact the economic forum in, I guess, in July or August or
August, yeah.
August, yeah.
Jackson Hole.
Jackson Hole. But for that local economy out there, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
between Idaho and Wyoming, it's one of those key routes there. So local businesses, unfortunately, will likely be impacted.
And the Rocky Mountain Summit, whenever that comes up, I think the tech one was in May. Whenever that comes up also, you basically would have to take the long way around, so down south around that whole mountain range, which apparently, this is all Mike McKee, by the way, adds about an hour to the trip, or you have to fly into a different location, which is only about 15 minutes longer, but there might not be as many frequent flights, et cetera. But when you say we need infrastructure help, this shows we need infrastructure help. I mean, to rebuild all of this and the local economy, like you mentioned, I mean, if it takes, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months to rebuild, this is what they have right now, especially in the summer season. This really hurts.
Yep, well, I'm getting ready to go on New Jersey Transit, so hopefully that infrastructure will hold for another day.
I mean, you're not crossing this, so I guess you're probably okay. That wraps it up for Paul and myself on this Monday. This is Bloomberg Intelligence. You have Balance of Power with Joe Matthew up next.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The Secretary of State heads back to the Middle East after a weekend that saw 4 Israeli hostages rescued and a member of Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet step down. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As President Biden prepares for the G7 later on this week, we'll be joined by Bloomberg White House correspondent Josh Wingrove with insights today from Christopher Smart, managing partner at Arbroath Group, with his eyes as well on EU elections from over the weekend and potential market impact. Donald Trump back with his first major rally since the verdict. We've got new polling out today, and Hunter Biden's defense team rests. Analysis from our panel, Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributor, and Chapin Fay, Republican strategist at Actum, all after a look at Wall Street. Let's do that first right now, as always, with Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Lots going on this Back to Work Monday. Right now, we are looking at a mixed U.S. stock market. The Dow lower by 12 now. Little change, down less than 1/10%. S&P up 5, up 1/10%. NASDAQ up 40 now, higher by about 0.2%. 10-year yield 4.46% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.87%. Spot gold up 0.6%, 23.08 right now. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.5%, 77.42 right now on WTI. More than 20 climate activists were arrested outside Citigroup's headquarters in downtown Manhattan this morning after they gathered to block bank employees from entering the building. Citigroup shares today down 0.9%. CrowdStrike, KKR, and GoDaddy all higher today after Friday's announcement from S&P Dow Jones Indices that they're going to be included into the S&P 500 index. But right now, CrowdStrike up 9.3%, KKR up 10.5%, GoDaddy up now by 2.3%. Again, we're looking at a mixed market here with the Dow Industrials lower, down 0.1%. We do have the S&P up 0.1%. Seema Shah is Chief Global Strategist at Principal Global Asset Management in London. She says markets need to be more focused on election risk, not just overseas, but also here in the U.S.
You know, we came into this year knowing that this would be the year of elections. So many elections around the world. We have this continued focus, of course, on the US, but so many different parts of the world where there can be upsets, as you've seen in the last week with India and Mexico as well. So I think it's a good reminder that that political risk probably does need to be priced back into the market to some extent.
Markets and elections, great reason to keep it locked into Balance of Power. Seema Shah, by the way, is with Principal Global in London. Recapping, the Dow lower right now, down 0.1%, S&P up 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, we thank you. Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. It's great to see you. Welcome back. The 10th of June. Can you believe it? It's going quick. And this is the breather, the moment for Joe Biden to regroup before the next big stop on the international tour, coming off of his trip to France last week. We talked about it a lot, marking the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion, important meetings with President Zelensky, with Emmanuel Macron, and now it's on to the G7. All of this with a weekend in between that was quite newsy, from Israel to EU elections. And that's where we start our conversation with Josh Wingrove, Bloomberg White House correspondent, back on the beat today and joining us from the North Lawn of the White House. If you're with us on YouTube, it's great to see you. Josh, thanks for joining. What do the next couple of days look like for Joe Biden as he prepares for the G7? The stakes seem to be rising even as he makes his way toward this trip.
Yeah, Joe, good afternoon. He'll come back later today. He has a Juneteenth concert here this evening, but all eyes really are going to be on that trip later in the week, and whether they can sort of make headway in particular on the question of seized Russian assets, and is there any way to essentially monetize them somehow to get Ukraine billions in aid sooner rather than sort of waiting for these processes to drag out. There's been a lot of disagreement on that, but it seems like they've come to some sort of agreement. President Biden saying over the weekend after a meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron that the two had discussed it and they'd come to some sort of understanding. So we'll be looking at that, and in some ways this is because this G7 is poised to maybe change quite a bit. The elections that we had in Europe, of course, have sent a signal both in France and Germany about voter moods there. We've got elections in the UK later this year, in the US, maybe one in Canada in the next year or so. So a lot of change may be coming. A lot of these leaders might be swapping out. Of course, Donald Trump is looming in the offing. And if they can sort of stock the cupboard a little bit on Ukraine aid, that will sort of, maybe tie the hands a little bit of, or try to, the people that come after. So you might call this a little bit of Trump-proofing maybe, but of course Biden wouldn't see it that way because he intends on being here in a second term. So he would dispute that characterization.
Right. Well, tell me more about the seizing of Russian assets, or more of the cashing in of Russian assets and sending that money to Ukraine, because the president signed into law something called the Repo Act. It got a lot of debate here on Capitol Hill, and the analysis is that that's great, but most of the money is in Europe, and so we can't do a lot without the cooperation of our European allies. Does that begin to clarify at this G7?
We think so, although the exact terms remain unclear, and it might not necessarily be clear by the time the G7 wraps up and they issue their communique, but it looks like that communique will have at least a top-line commitment to something. The latest plan has been revolving around either the U.S. alone or the U.S. and some other countries offering tens of billions in funding as a loan to Ukraine, securitized essentially by these holdings. Now, the math on that gets complicated, the rules get complicated on whether that's going to Congress or not, what guarantees Europe can legally provide when they've got 6-month renewals of sanctions. It's messy, but it seems like they're getting somewhere. Essentially, this has been the U.S. pressing to do something, and the Europeans being hesitant for a range of reasons, among them legal ones, and the question of, well, if we sort of, tie up these assets by some sort of complex funding model, and then we need to release them as part of, say, a peace deal, where does that leave us? So it does look like they're going to have progress on this one. That's a real top line. Another one, Joe, that we're watching for is some action on China. We saw that with the G7 finance ministers in their meeting. We think that the leaders will sort of sing a united tune when it comes to warning about China overcapacity and the risk of Beijing essentially dumping its way to an economic recovery. So we'll be watching for that as well. But those are the big ones. I think broadly, though, it's just going to be a show of unity, echoing some of the themes we saw last week with the president's D-Day visit, and some of those that I expect to see in a month or so here in Washington at the NATO summit.
Just in our last minute here, Josh, the president's also got Benjamin Netanyahu on the line, presumably. The Secretary of State back in the Middle East here. I believe it's trip number 8. And there are questions about whether we are further away now from a ceasefire than we were before these hostages were rescued over the weekend in a raid that included the deaths of more than 200 Palestinians.
Yeah, right now it's up in the air where the U.S. views things. Right now, they have always said that they are waiting sort of on a formal response from Hamas, like a written response on the offer that Biden outlined about 10 days or so ago. We just don't know. Typically before trips, we do get briefings on this. Probably the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan would be a candidate to do that. So if he is to speak to the press or speak publicly before this trip to the G7, I'm sure, of course, top of mind will be the latest on this. So we're waiting and seeing, but this remains a fraught one, of course, Joe.
Josh, great to have you, as always. Josh Wingrove, Bloomberg White House correspondent, with us from the White House on a sunny Monday here in Washington as the president gets back to it in advance of the G7. And we add the voice now of Christopher Smart, a conversation we've been looking forward to with a voice of experience. He's managing partner of Arbroath, the strategic advisory firm, and was senior economic advisor in the Obama White House. Christopher, we just wrapped a conversation with Josh Wingrove talking about a very dangerous world that Joe Biden is operating in at the moment. And I'd love to start with you on Israel and your thoughts on what was quite a weekend here with not only the mission to rescue hostages, but Benny Gantz's decision to step down. Is a ceasefire suddenly on the back burner?
Well, I think it is, at least for the next few days and maybe weeks. It's always an understatement to talk about Israel, the Middle East in general, and say it's complicated, but it has gotten more complicated over the weekend, as you described. I think the ironic thing is everybody knows how this process needs to start and everybody knows how this process needs to end. But it's very difficult to know how to get from the beginning to the end. The beginning obviously has to be a ceasefire, and I think it's been pushed back, maybe a matter of days, maybe a matter of weeks, just in the events over the weekend. The process needs to end, I think, in a grand agreement that is sort of part of everybody's talking points, that would include Palestinian governance that does not include Hamas, that would include a more centrist Israeli government. It would include, importantly, Saudi recognition of Israel, which would create a regional buy-in to a peace process. And then lastly, what's very easy to say and very difficult to implement is a two-state solution for this, for Israelis and Palestinians. As I say, it's very easy to say and very easy to describe, and I think it's very easy to get buy-in all around for that endpoint. But it is a very big question about how we get from here to there.
The U.S. asking the UN Security Council now to vote on this latest resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza. Does that mean anything to Benjamin Netanyahu?
I'm not sure it means anything to Benjamin Netanyahu, but I do think it means something more broadly to an Israeli political class that sees itself much more isolated in the world, that sees the end game in Gaza as much more complicated. For example, what does it really mean to get Hamas completely out of Gaza? That's a very difficult thing to describe and to plan for the day after. What it does do, importantly, I think, for President Biden, it allows him to go to the G7 meetings later this week, much more closely aligned with Europeans and the Japanese Prime Minister for pushing a ceasefire forward. And I think that's very helpful for him and should be helpful for getting us to that next step in Israel.
I wonder your thoughts, Christopher, on a now eighth trip, an eighth tour through the Middle East by Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Is this helpful? Is he helping to bridge the gap? Does that presence mean something, or is he somehow lowering the value of these trips by going so often?
Well, I think he's got a long way to go to catch up with Henry Kissinger in his Middle East diplomacy. But I think these meetings are very important because the very fact that the U.S. Secretary of State continues to talk to all sides, continues to bring messages back and forth, continues to look for where there may be wiggle room, where there may be room for the beginnings of an agreement. These things are never sort of completely baked and agreed. You have to kind of find a path forward and find a moment where a potential partial temporary agreement may fall into place that allows you to build on something stronger and more lasting. But I think it is very important for him to continue these trips, and I don't think they lose value the more he is engaged.
Well, as Joe Biden prepares for the G7 later this week, the headline from over the weekend in EU elections says it all on the terminal. Macron and Schultz get trounced by far right in EU elections. That has been the headline largely by the media. Europe tilts right. What does it mean for Joe Biden's conversations later this week?
Well, I would actually just take a quick step back and say the real headline this weekend is that following the 80th anniversary of D-Day celebrations, 300 million Europeans got to go to the polls and hold free, fair elections on a parliament that is governing increasingly important policy issues for the continent, on trade, on competition, and increasingly on foreign policy. So I know that's not the headline, but I think it is worth taking a step back before we jump into the details to keep some perspective on that. The bad news, of course, well, I'll have another good news headline, which is the center seems to have held. The coalition of parties from the center of right that have generally supported current President Ursula von der Leyen looks like it is emerging quite strong from these elections, and that she will continue most likely to be the leader the European Commission. And so that also is good news for Europe that remains committed to Ukraine's support, remains committed to further integration. Now, to your point about weakened leaders in Germany and France, those are the two biggest economies in the European Union. Those are the drivers of European integration. And both of them, as you say, have emerged quite badly injured from these results. Olaf Scholz has another year and a half, roughly, to go before he needs to call an election. President Macron surprised us all by calling his own election. He remains in office for another 3 years, but I think he feels the need to really shake things up. It's a big gamble in France, which is seeing its own financial situation begin to deteriorate. It was downgraded. Its debt was downgraded last week, and the prospects of a new government that takes control of that fiscal path look dim right now, and that's why you've seen the markets sell off quite quickly. For President Biden, to get back to your question, I think he'll most likely ignore these near-term results and focus on these longer-term issues of agreement with European leaders on how to help Ukraine, as Josh walked us through before, on how to confront China and its exports that are flooding U.S. and European markets, and I think how to try and align themselves as closely as possible on a path forward in the Middle East.
But you said something really important there, Christopher Smart. This is why we wanted to talk to you, is for perspective. We're seeking context here at Bloomberg constantly, because you said that could be a very different headline, the center held. And while we did see some voters turn to the right, I wonder to what extent you see the war in Ukraine pushing them in that direction.
I think a couple things have pushed them in that direction. One is the war in Ukraine, which is a serious security risk to the European Union. It's also a political affront. The European Union is built on the inviolability of borders, and the fact that Russia felt that it could cross over into Ukraine with impunity. I think many Europeans take that sort of personally and emotionally, and I think that's part of it. The other thing we don't talk about so much anymore, but is the COVID response. The EU responded very quickly and vigorously to COVID and put a lot of money into people's pockets. There are also a continuing stream of subsidies that come from Brussels to many EU countries right now. And importantly, the reason that it's important to focus on the fact that the center-right held is that even these extreme right parties that we're talking about right now, and they pose their own danger, I don't want to minimize that, but they are not running on a let's pull out of Europe platform the way they were a few years ago. They're running on a let's do it differently, let's bring a few more powers back to the capitals. But it would be very hard for any of them to say, let's pull out now. Gosh, let's see what happened to the UK when they pulled out. That wasn't really a great story to tell. And the UK is still limping from its wounds on that decision. And so I think the far right parties are very important to monitor, but they are not calling into question European institutions.
Well, I'm really glad we could talk to you today. Christopher Smart, many thanks for joining us here on Bloomberg. From Arbroath, this is Bloomberg.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We are looking at a mixed Monday here with the Dow lower, S&P, NASDAQ. They are both in the green right now, but the stock market is struggling to gain much traction as a sell-off in European assets weighs on sentiment. Traders also positioning for this week's Federal Reserve decision on Wednesday and key inflation data. S&P up 9 now, up 0.2%. The Dow in the red, down less than 0.1%, little changed. On NASDAQ is up 67, a gain of 0.4%. 10-year, 4.45%. The 2-year, 4.87%. Gold up 0.7%, 23.10 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.5%. WTI, 77.43 for a barrel of WTI. More consolidation in the energy industry. Noble Corp, the world's biggest offshore oil rig contractor by market value, has agreed to buy its smaller rival, Diamond Offshore Drilling, in a deal valued at about $1.6 billion. Right now, Noble is up by 5.1%. Diamond Offshore up by 10.2%. Recapping, S&P up 9, up 0.2%. Balance of power continues now. The Monday edition. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
Monday it is, Charlie. Good thing it doesn't feel like it. Wait a minute. Welcome to Balance of Power. Great to see you here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and YouTube, where you can always find us. Search Bloomberg Global News. Our live feed is cranking along with breaking news here. Here we go again. You know, we don't have days off around here. Closing arguments now underway in Hunter Biden's trial. We're keeping an eye on a couple of legal matters today, as it also happens to be the same day that Donald Trump has his first interview with his probation officer. Welcome to the new normal. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, and glad to have at the table Laura Davison, who's covering this for us as Bloomberg Politics editor. She has to have her eyes on all of the stories that we're going to talk about here, and it's great to see you on a quiet Monday in Washington. Hunter Biden, this is moving along pretty quick. Does that mean we get a verdict this week?
That seems very likely. So there'll be closing arguments today. Then this will go straight to the jury. They've already had their jury instructions, something that everyone's now very familiar with, after just having done this a couple weeks ago with Trump's hush money trial. So either later today at the earliest, or perhaps tomorrow or later this week, we could see a verdict here. Really striking to have a verdict of both the president's son and Trump within 2 weeks basically of one another.
If you listen to the analysis, though, the conventional wisdom, I keep hearing how Donald Trump's trial isn't going to matter to anybody in the end. It doesn't make a dent. He's just making money off of it. But Hunter Biden, who's not running for president, is going to somehow damage his father's campaign as the incumbent here. Is there truth to that? Does Joe Biden need to worry? I don't
know that Hunter Biden is really going to hurt his dad's campaign. Those opinions are already really baked in, and we've seen a little bit from there's now been a series of polls done post conviction in that Biden has gained a point or two across these polls on average, which in a very close race, a point or two is the difference maker.
That's the election, right? We've got new numbers today, and as I mentioned a second ago, Donald Trump has his first interview with his probation officer, virtual, by the way. But incidentally, we talk a lot about people getting special treatment around. That's a very unusual thing, like giving the former president a Zoom meeting so as to not disrupt the courthouse, essentially. Is that how we should read that?
Yes. So generally, you as the defendant would have to go there, to the officer, have this meeting. There was already talk initially that they would probably come to Trump. Now they're allowing him to Zoom in. So that's really quite special treatment.
I can only imagine what they'll discuss. Like, how does that conversation begin? We certainly know who Donald Trump is.
Yeah, I mean, so generally this would be sort of a get to know you, so the probation officer could understand their life, their family situation, what they do for work, all of this kind of things that is obviously no secret to anyone. How do you go out and ask Donald Trump, what exactly do you do for a living? Run for president?
Right. Yeah. Well, he's running. As we saw in Vegas over the weekend, I want to ask you about the tips and the taxes. But the latest CBS News YouGov poll puts a new number on the impact of the verdict. So this is what we were just talking about. 28% of likely voters say the former president's conviction will be a major factor in their vote. So it's a non-story. Is that fair to say?
28%, but still, it's those undecided voters that are perhaps the most likely to be swayed by this. We need, and of course, the undecided voters in these key states. Also, the thing here that undercuts really all of this is the election is still 5 months away. Imagine what was happening 5 months ago. That was your top concern. Gaza was a lot more fresh. There's just the issues changed a lot. New things can pop up in the interim.
So Donald Trump goes to Vegas. He's out there in the blazing sun. The teleprompter's not working. He goes through the border, a lot of the sort of greatest hits, but he stops down with one interesting one, directly appealing to voters there, who many of whom work in the hospitality industry. It's Las Vegas, by promising to eliminate taxes on tips. You hear a lot about, oh, well, just election year stunt. That's what they would say to Joe Biden with the border, or maybe student loans. I mean, that is what this is, right? But it seems to be going over pretty well as an idea.
Well, so depends who you ask. So I have covered taxes for about a decade, and this is the first time I have ever heard this idea of not taxing tips. Of course, this is a direct way to appeal to the service industry, you know, which is made up of young people and people of color, two groups that Trump is very much going after.
And in Vegas, that's SEIU, that's the strip, right? That's the culinary workers.
That's the economy of Nevada, you know, are this hospitality industry. You know, and what gives this idea some credence is that in 2025 there is going to be a tax fight in Washington. Trump's 2017 tax cuts, they expire. That means Congress has to open up the tax code and figure out something. So ideas like this, even if they're off the wall, this is the kind of thing that economists hate. They're saying, look, let's look at, you know, lowering rates across the board, not having these weird curve-outs. Oh yes, Maya McGinnis would not be a fan of this idea at all. I have not spoken with her about this, but just having spoken with her
we need to get
many
a call
times.
out to Maya. But he's also promising something on behalf of Congress here. Is that where we're going?
So he said he would ask Congress to do this. You know, as a reminder, Congress has to touch every single tax policy. The president can't do this unilaterally. But, you know, these are the kind of ideas that Trump likes to, you know, throw out. He talked about a payroll tax cut. You know, he talked about taking the corporate tax rate all the way down to 15%. Once that gets to Congress, Republican leadership is like, oh, hold on, wait, we have not signed off on that. That's not the direction we're going. So then it becomes this little inter-party squabble to get Trump to move off of his original policy, but make it seem like he did it himself.
Is Joe Biden now proposed no taxes on tips? Is that how this works?
You know, this is interesting because this is also, you know, Joe Biden talks about, you know, middle-income families, low-income workers, you know, how he wants to boost them. You know, we've already seen some messaging here saying, look, we want to, you know, strengthen the middle class, but this is not the way to go about doing this.
Interesting. Fascinating. He talked about January 6 rioters as well. And this has become part of the, you know, the stump speech. But in this case, he called them the January 6 warriors and said that they had been set up that day. This has become a real big thrust in his campaign. There's talk of him being joined by the January 6th choir on stage at the convention. He said that he might pardon them. How far does this go?
This has really been a complete rewrite of history in many regards, of just how Trump has been talking about this, as well as you talk to his big donors, the CEOs who all denounced him after January 6th. Yeah. Trump is going to be meeting this Thursday at the Business Roundtable, which is the big trade group for CEOs.
This is an important story.
Have, you know, all the top business leaders are going to be there. And folks that said they wouldn't give to Trump, they wouldn't give to Republicans who, you know, voted against certifying the election, are now sitting down and meeting with Trump. So we've really seen this complete shift from January 6th being this toxic thing to now it being, oh, look at these people who were, you know, fighting for freedom or somehow set up. It's a really shocking transition.
There was a time when major corporations said they wouldn't donate to any congressional candidate who was somehow sympathizing with January 6ers. This was a kind of a real movement for a moment, and it's like it never happened, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of, you know, lobbying firms and you know, corporate PACs, they had lists up in their offices that would be like, here are the, you know, the names of the 40 or 50 or 60 Republicans who voted to not certify. And you know, this is pretty much gone because they've realized that the Republican Party is now, for the most part, in the House especially, you know, don't acknowledge the outcome of the 2020 election.
What does that tell us about his big fundraising week? We made some headlines last week with Donald Trump doing the West Coast swing. The big donors, not just the supporters who send $50 to help him with his legal bills, but the big donors are all showing up now. The Adelsons, the Ackmans. This is complete, essentially, in his money takeover. Is that fair to say?
Yes. So, you know, Biden had led on the money front throughout the campaign. He just really had blown Trump out of the water. And that was his one sort of big, you know, quantifiable area where he was leading. Look, you know, even if he, you know, is down in the polls, he can use that money to buy advertising. Trump, in just the span of about 6 weeks, has nearly closed that gap. We'll get the final data later next week, but you know, we're basically expecting that Trump will be neck and neck, if not exceeding Biden's cash.
Reminding us how early this is. We've got a debate coming. I've got to ask you, this is what, the 27th of June? There's no agreement on rules here, right? Are we sure this is happening? Because the last time we talked about it, it was anyone's guess.
So here's what we know, that this will be in the CNN studios in Atlanta. There will be microphones that cut off after the candidates'
They're both
time.
signing off on that?
They have both signed off on that. There will be no audience. I think one thing that just to always have in your back of mind is that Trump does like to come in and change the rules at the last minute. So there is always a room for a last minute change here. But for right now, both campaigns say that they are committed to showing up in a couple weeks and debating in an
So this
empty
sounds
studio.
like it's really happening.
For now, yes. I personally have a bit of skepticism always.
Sure.
Of
to your point, he hasn't been to a debate yet this cycle.
I have a flight
Donald
scheduled
Trump
for that day to go on a
Neither of
trip,
them
and I
have.
still haven't moved it.
Is that true?
If that tells you where I am
Listen
on the
to this,
likelihood
playing
of this
the
happening.
odds. Wow, I love that. Because you would kind of have to work that night, right?
I will
As our
certainly have to
political
work
editor.
that night if this is happening.
Maybe you'll be on the Wi-Fi at 30,000 feet. With that said, Kamala Harris was talking big game about a vice presidential debate over the weekend, even setting up a potential for an empty podium. She says she'll be at CBS studios no matter what. Is the Trump campaign committing to something without a candidate, or does that stay up in the air?
They have sort of notionally agreed to this, but of course they don't have a candidate, and they won't until, Trump has said he's going to wait until the convention. We could have him, trotting out multiple apprentice-style candidates on stage and picking one in front of everyone. So, that won't really be resolved till mid-July.
Wouldn't it be the flex for Donald Trump to show up like a half an hour late, keep the president up there alone, walk in, be like, all right, we can start now?
That would be something.
Something's going to happen that night we can't imagine, right?
It's going to be wild, and I think you're going to have almost like when he had the Supreme Court pick where he had both candidates driving to D.C. Right. We're going to see something dramatic like that.
The only surprise would be a state affair. That would be my guess at this point. Laura Davison, great to see you. Happy Monday. Welcome back to the machine. Bloomberg Politics editor walking us through it. Here at the beginning of an interesting week, we'll be talking about the effects and the benefits of incumbency in a couple of days when Joe Biden shows up at the G7. Our panel is up next. First, world and national news with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Closing arguments are underway in Hunter Biden's federal gun trial. His defense attorneys rested their case earlier without calling Hunter Biden to the stand. Prosecutors have argued that the evidence is clear Hunter Biden was in the throes of addiction when he checked no to being on drugs when he filled out a form to obtain a gun. Defense attorneys have suggested he was trying to turn his life around at the time and had completed a rehabilitation program. Former President Trump is meeting with his probation officer today. Trump will reportedly take part in a virtual interview with the officer in New York City. He'll be at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. This all comes after his conviction last month on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Trump is set to be sentenced on July 11th. The U.S. Supreme Court will be looking at a multi-billion-dollar shareholder lawsuit that accuses Facebook parent Meta of misleading investors. The case involves allegations the company inflated share prices by inadequately disclosing the risks posed by a data harvesting scandal involving Cambridge Analytica, a political consulting firm. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is working on a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. He's been meeting today with Egyptian and Israeli officials, and he's sounding hopeful.
I think this is a critical moment because we see the possibility, we see the prospect of an immediate ceasefire, of getting all the hostages home, of getting on the path to a durable resolution to the conflict in Gaza.
Blinken says a ceasefire is desperately needed. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow lower, the S&P, NASDAQ, both in the green right now. Equities hovering near records, struggling, though, for direction ahead of the Fed decision on Wednesday. Right now, the S&P's up 8, 53.55. That is a gain of 0.1%. Dow Industrials down 36, a drop there of just about 0.1%, while NASDAQ is up 57, higher now by 0.3%. 10-year at 4.46% with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.87%. Spot gold up 0.8%, 23.11 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.5%, 77.44 right now on WTI. Investors may be in store for a bit of a yawner when Fed officials meet on interest rates tomorrow and Wednesday. And with a look ahead, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
It looks like central bankers will hold U.S. rates at a 2-decade high as the threat of worsening inflation lingers. Last week's strong payroll data probably reinforced the Fed's determination to stand pat. Wages also rose. Bond traders, for the most part, signal no Fed action before December. Bloomberg Economics, however, has a different take. It anticipates a downturn in the labor market and sees the Fed's dot plot economic projections signaling 2 rate cuts this year. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
NVIDIA shares up now by 1.4%. NVIDIA's 10-for-1 stock split has taken effect, giving investors 9 additional shares for every one that they already own. NVIDIA right now up by 1.4%. Again, recapping, stocks are mixed. The Dow lower, S&P, NASDAQ both in the green. S&P right now up by about 0.2%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington, and once again your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio on